IVM.
The Indian economy is in trouble. Our growth is the lowest it has been in years. Foreign direct investment is on the down low. The auto sector is not doing well. So how do you draw up a blueprint for the economy? About 75 years ago, a couple of men came together. These were important men in their own rights. Industrialists like J.R.D. Tata, G.D. Birla, Purushottam Das Thakurdas, economists like Ardashish Dalal and E.D. Shroff, and even the first finance minister, John Mathai. They drew up a plan for the Indian economy in 1944. And we could take a leaf or two from their plan to see what we can glean about the economy today. Hello and welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and every week on the show, I talk about global affairs and foreign policy. Now, we like to call India an emerging power or a rising power. But this power rests on our potential, and if our economy is anything to go by, our potential is very circumspect. The Asian Development Bank, which projected Indian growth at 7.2% for the year 2020, has now slashed this figure down to 6%. The export of goods and services have declined from 25% of GDP in 2013-14 to less than 20% in 2019. Our unemployment stands at a 45-year high. Passenger vehicle sales have fallen by 30% in just July. The last time it fell this low was in the year 2000. Houston, we don't just have a problem, we're living on borrowed time. If we do intend on ever becoming a $5 trillion economy, we're going to need 8% growth. And we're going to need reforms, fast ones. I'm not going to get into what reforms we need for India's economy now. No, instead I'm going to throw back to 1944, when some of the most visionary men in this country came together to write down a blueprint for the economy. Today, the Bombay Plan is largely forgotten, even though it has an important part of influencing our 5-year plans since 1947. My guest for today is Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Dr. Baru has served as the Secretary General of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, or FICCI. He's also served as the Director for Geoeconomics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He was the official spokesperson and media advisor for the former Prime Minister of India and has authored the book The Accidental Prime Minister, among others. Last year, Dr. Baru, along with Meghnad Desai, edited a book of essays on the Bombay Plan, which I highly recommend you read. Today, Dr. Baru and I are delving into the Bombay Plan, what it entailed, why it was written, and most importantly, how is it relevant to some of the discussions on the economy today. But before we get into the conversation, let's hear from IVM Podcasts.
Hey everybody, you know what we've got? We've got another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So if you haven't been following us on YouTube, please do a search for IVM CCTV and get a peek inside what's going on in the studio. You can see excerpts from Cyrus Says, Naveen from Keeping It Queer, Akash from Varta Lab. There's stuff that we've done with Feeding 10 Billion. There are a whole bunch of little videos over there. Give it a watch and let us know what you think about that. This week on Cyrus Says, it's a podcast crossover as hosts of our new show, KBCD Farhad Karkaria and Sunitra Lairi join Cyrus to talk about the meaning of being queer, how to define labels and how their podcast came about. Also, speaking of KBCD, Farhad and Sunitra in their show delve into the family stories and recalling what it was like to navigate queerness as a kid. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by two guests, Ankur Chaudhary and Swapnil Bhaskar. They're the co-founders at Goldwise. They discuss the new features at Goldwise and transitioning from regular to direct mutual funds. On Golgappa, Trupti is joined by Mahesh Ane, award-winning cinematographer who is known for his work on Swades. He talks about the ups and downs that he encountered along the way in the film industry. On Ganatantra, Alok and Saryu are joined by Smitana Saikia of Flame University, Pune to talk about the history and impact of the NRC list and how it has caused marginalization in the Northeast. On another crossover, this time on What a Player, Mikhail and Siddhartha are joined by Sivram Parmeswaran, the host of the podcast Football Shitball. They talk about the thrill of watching football and following a club. On Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Janice and Anirudh look back at the best and worst moments of the 2019 Emmy Awards. On Advertising is Dead, Varun is joined by singer-songwriter Ankur Tiwari, who talks about how artists find new forms of expression and monetize their work. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi, Dr. Baru. Welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm very happy that you're joining me today.
Well, my pleasure.
So, in 1944, it's a very dynamic world. World War II is just dying down. You have D-Day that happens across Asia. You have anti-colonial movements that are going on. And it's a particularly interesting time in India. And this is the time when the Bombay Plan is written. Could you tell me a little more about what the Bombay Plan is?
It's a unique document because nowhere in the third world, in the colonies across Africa, Latin America, Asia, there were all the European colonies across the world. We do not have anywhere a similar document produced by a group of indigenous businessmen about long-term development of their country. So it's a very interesting combination of a group of people who are thinking about on a year-to-year basis. As businessmen, they're looking at the balance sheet, they're looking at profit and loss, they're looking at the short term. But this is a 15-year plan for India.
Okay.
So in that sense, it's a unique document. And the question arises, why did that document get written in India? I think one, of course, is the fact that many in India at that time, including our business leaders, were hugely impressed by the Soviet experience. And Soviet Union had started 5-year plans and long-term planning. So there's a tremendous influence of the Soviet experience on India. And already by the 1920s, the industrial development had already started. So we had about 2 decades of industrialization moving forward. So I think by the mid-40s, there was enough experience with industrial development for businessmen to understand what are the preconditions necessary for this to be sustained on a long-term basis. And they identified each of the barriers to India's long-term development, whether it's land reform, agrarian change, education, healthcare, basic infrastructure, schooling, technical skills, and of course, most important, capital. And all of that is discussed in great detail.
This is very interesting because we know that our planning commissions and stuff draw heavily from the Soviet experience. But it's interesting to think of a group of capitalists also taking from the Soviet experience because the two would seem very at odds with each other.
True, but these are capitalists in a colony, first of all. In 1944, we were still a colony. And many of them had emerged as industrialists in the preceding 20 years, basically from after the First World War. So they were still struggling with the policy framework of a colony. And they were inspired by the Soviet experience because the Soviet Union also unshackled itself from feudalism, from dictatorial rule, and established a workers' party in power. So in that sense, they were inspired by the experience of how rapidly Russia had industrialized. But also, if you look at Europe itself, and many of them went and studied in Britain, Britain was heavily influenced by the Soviet experience. So if you look at the kind of economics that was taught in the interwar period in British universities, there was a lot of focus on planning and the role of the state. And during the war itself, the government became an extremely important economic player in all the capitalist economies because there was rationing, wartime rationing, there was wartime production, government dictated production. So whether it was Britain or France or the US or any of the European countries, they all also were emphasizing the role of the state. And in a colony like India, which was very backward, hardly had any capital goods industry, hardly had any technical education, hardly had any education, in fact, for that matter. Clearly, these businessmen realized that they didn't have the money to invest in all of this. And therefore, the government had to come and play a big role.
And I think it's also important to remember that in the 1920s, you had the Great Depression that played out in America, and that sort of affected different parts of Europe as well. And perhaps that is why they wanted more state control to come into their countries.
Exactly. I mean, the whole Keynesian economics came out of that period, right, in the 1930s. And the whole idea of government spending being a stimulus, the concept of a multiplier in macroeconomic theory, that if the government spends 1 rupee, it actually multiplies, and over a period of time, the economy generates, a multiple of that 1 rupee. And so growth can be stimulated by government spending. So this was a very powerful idea that Keynes introduced. And the economist in this group, I've not mentioned the names of the authors. We had J.R.D. Tata, who was the person who took the initiative because the Tata sons funded, in fact, the research work.
Okay.
And much of the writing was done by John Mathai, who was at that time an advisor in the Tata group. Later became the first finance minister of Jawaharlal Nehru's government.
Okay.
And there are 3 or 4 other people working for the Tatas who also worked on this document. So J.R.D. Tata was clearly the leader of the group. Then there was G.D. Birla, there was Purushottam Das Thakur Das, there was Adarshil Dalal, there was Lala Sriram, and Shroff. So all of them were very influential people at that point in time. And they understood the European experience. They understood what was happening in the rest of the world. And they recognized that in India, if growth has to be sustained over a long period of time, the government has to play a big role.
So when I looked at the appendices of your book, I saw the Bombay Plan in its entirety, and it was very interesting to see the scope of everything that they'd covered. It was a very intensive document. So what exactly was it? Was it a blueprint? Was it a program? What was its intention?
This is actually the most fascinating part of the Bombay Plan. Because these guys were not just talking in the air. They were not writing some manifesto saying, we should do this, we should do that, we should become a $5 trillion economy, as we now say. They were not talking about big numbers. They are saying, if you want over a 15-year period of time to double per capita income, then what is the kind of investment needed? If food consumption has to increase, if all Indians have to be fed, and then the calculated calories. This is the first time that there's a calculation of how much an individual should eat. And later on, all the poverty studies that were done, all the estimation of poverty in India after independence, including in the last several years, goes back to this. This is the first study that said for a human being to work efficiently for 8 hours a day, this is the kind of calorie consumption he needs. For this calorie consumption, how much wheat should be produced, how much rice should be produced, how many, what kind of poultry development is, so they broke it down into specific numbers. And then they asked for an individual over a year, how many yards of cloth would be needed. For a woman, how many saris? For a man, how many dhotis or trousers or shirt? They calculated. This is the population of India. This is the amount of cloth needed. This is the population of India. This is the amount of food grain needed. This is the population of India. This is the amount of housing needed. So, and for this amount of housing, how much cement do you have to produce? How much iron and steel you have to produce? So it's such a detailed exercise. And it's like creating building blocks of development. Then they put it all together and said, this is the total expenditure needed over a 15-year period. And how will the government raise this? So some of it you raise it through taxation, but India was still a very poor country. Tax revenues could not have been very high. Some of it could be borrowed, but a substantial part would simply mean printing money. And that is what deficit financing was all about.
Okay. This is interesting because today we still bemoan the lack of data that exists. And I can't imagine how they managed to sort of gather this in 1944 and research it. You'd mentioned before that the Tatas had taken sort of the lead in researching it. But how did they go about doing the research for this document?
Well, the basic data was available. For example, population, we had the census already. Yeah. So we had the idea of what was India's population. And then they estimated, as I said, how much should people consume in a day, what are the calories. The idea about calories, etc. was already there. And how much. So these are all estimates that they generated based on a simple number, which is the size of the population.
Okay, that's interesting. The thing that it also leads to is when you say print money, that sounds like a rather controversial step. So what was the reactions to some of the things that they said?
At that time, this was not a controversial idea.
Okay.
Because the idea of deficit financing was already being talked about even in Western countries. And this was again one of Keynes's contribution to macroeconomic policy. So it was not a controversial idea. It was not frowned upon. And in fact, if you see, and that is what we say in this book. In fact, all my co-authors, each one of them has made this point that if you look at the first 5-year plan of Free India, written by the Planning Commission headed by Mahalanobis, and Jawaharlal Nehru was the chairman, and you look at the second plan, these are all basically taking forward the ideas in the Bombay Plan. We think of Mahalanobis as the father of planning in India and of Nehruvian model of development, but the real ideas came out of the Bombay Plan. And these guys, and of course I must add here that many of the ideas in the Bombay Plan owe to a large number of Indian economists who are quoted in the Bombay Plan document, who had been teaching in University of Bombay, University of Banaras Hindu University, Delhi, Osmania University, etc. Most famous of them was, Radha Kamal Mukherjee, Vera Anstey, B.R. Shinoy, V.K.R.V. Rao. Many of them were already writing on the Indian economy. They are studying the Indian economy. So there was existing literature available on which they could draw.
Which is, when you think of sort of Nehruvian economics and the great socialist, you don't really assume the correlation between that and the Bombay Plan. In fact, I doubt how many people even know of the Bombay Plan except for in particular circles. But at that point in time, what was the reception to it when it was first released in 1944?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. In fact, the reason why we wrote this book, the reason why Meghnad Desai and I felt the time had come to put this book together was precisely this: how many people know about the Bombay Plan? It's not even taught in our universities. Fortunately, Meghnad and I belong to a generation where when we were students, we were taught the Bombay Plan. Okay. But, it just went out of textbooks. And so we thought it's time to revive the memory and bring it back into mainstream discussion. Particularly because, there's a lot of thinking about economic policy going on in the last few years with the change of regime. So we thought this is a good time to remind people the kind of original thinking that happened here. But the question of reception to the Bombay Plan, it was mixed. There were many businessmen who did not like the idea of the role of the state in the Bombay Plan. It's not as if all of Indian business accepted this idea. So there were many businessmen who came out and criticized the authors of the Bombay Plan, saying, you are assigning too big a role to government. And this will result in exactly what we don't want, which is a kind of Soviet-style economy where the government dominates. So there was a right-wing critic of the Bombay Plan. But interestingly, there was also a left-wing critic. The communists opposed it, saying, these businessmen want public money to be spent for their growth and prosperity, right? So the Marxists attacked the Bombay Plan, the capitalists attacked the Bombay Plan, so it got attacked from both sides.
I don't know if we can classify these men as liberals, but it seems like not a lot has changed when it comes to them being fired upon by both sides of the spectrum.
Sure.
And what about after a couple of years, you said that it had a legacy on planning. So it did affect the way we looked at development in this country, because they spoke about things that were far ahead of its time, including conversations about public health, conversations about agriculture, conversations about which industry we should invest in, and things like that. So what do you think its legacies were on the larger Indian economy?
It's a pity that they didn't, in fact, leave a bigger imprint on policy than they ought to have. In fact, you draw attention to a very important idea in the Bombay Plan, which is public health. They were impressed by what was being done again in the Soviet Union, but also in some other European countries, where there was publicly funded health care emerging. And part of the reason, of course, was the war, where government was paying more attention to healthcare. And then came out the Beveridge Plan and the NHS, the National Health System in the UK. But they understood the importance of public investment in education and health. And these are precisely the two things which we have neglected and which we now talk about. In fact, that was another motivation for us to write the Bombay Plan, that when the current government talks about, public investment in education, public investment in healthcare, new education policy, new healthcare policy, we are basically reinventing the wheel. These ideas have been spoken about earlier. And it is a fact that India neglected many of these ideas. On the issue of the other new ideas in the Bombay Plan, I think an extremely important idea, where again we didn't do enough, was land reform. They emphasize the importance of land reform, of redistribution of land to the tiller. And if you look at the Chinese experience, or even other developing countries, redistribution of land had a very positive impact on agricultural productivity. The end of landlordism was a positive impact on agricultural production and food availability. So they were very sure that India had to end feudalism, end landlordism, redistribute land to the tiller. These are all ideas in the Bombay Plan.
Wow, and they also speak about things like education, as you had mentioned. Yes. They talk about adult education, which is very Keynesian. And when you compare it to sort of the backlash against just capitalism in general and globalization in today's world, you can see that these are not sort of evil men who are trying to elevate their own positions in this. But then later they also were disappointed with the way that the Nehru government was carrying out some of the plans, right? Some of these men went to form the Swatantra Party. How did those dynamics work out?
That's again a very interesting phenomenon, because one, I think these were essentially nationalist businessmen. So they were thinking about the nation, about India. So while they were businessmen, they were capitalists, they were interested in the profit motive, they were of course very wealthy individually, etc. But the motivation for writing the Bombay Plan was really for to accelerate India's development. So it's very, very nationalist, and certainly the national movement influenced them. I mean, G.D. Birla, was very close to Mahatma Gandhi, and Gandhiji, in fact, finally died in Birla House. So therefore, there was a tremendous influence of the national movement. But after independence, and Nehru becomes Prime Minister, Nehru, for political reasons, partly because the communists became the main opposition in India. In the 62, 67 elections, the main opposition were actually the Communist Party of India. So Nehru, on the one hand, had to keep left of center. But also he was unable to carry out land reforms. In many states, the landlord class, in fact, came into the Congress party. And they were chief ministers and state level leaders. So on the one hand, he couldn't do land reform, which is an important recommendation of the Bombay Plan. On the other hand, he had more state control than was the idea in the Bombay Plan. So two kinds of trends emerged out of the original authors. G.D. Birla, being a pragmatic politician, very close to the Congress Party, etc., he took the view that, well, Nehru is now the Prime Minister, we have to live with him, you might as well, compromise with Nehru and support whatever he's doing. So the Birlas and many other Marwadi businessmen more or less became pro the Nehruvian regime, and we use the word crony capitalist today, businessmen who benefit from government support. Well, many of them were crony capitalists. In fact, we make the point in this book that people think of Adani, Ambani as crony capitalists today, but the original crony capitalists were the Birlas and the business groups that benefited from Nehru's regime. Then there was the other group, which was basically led by J.R.D. Tata, which was very unhappy with the direction Nehru was taking India in. So went and created the Swatantra Party, which was led by Rajagopalachari. And Tata funded the Swatantra Party. So you had one set of businessmen, and most of them based in Bombay, and another set of businessmen mostly based in Delhi or Calcutta or North India. So two different directions. And politics then evolved in the country in that manner. Swatantra Party was around for almost 20 years and finally died without being able to make an impact. The Congress, it kept being on the left of center. And, so we had Indira Gandhi and bank nationalization and all of that happened much later.
So you had a variety of other plans around this point in time, right? You have Gandhi going, villages are the heart of India. We need to empower our villages. And then you had something called the People's Plan, which is sort of a humanitarian vision for the world. So how was the Bombay Plan different from these other plans that existed at the same point?
Yeah. It's true. I mean, you had M.N. Roy was the author of the People's Plan, what was called. It was a kind of leftist plan, much more role for the state, much less private sector. Then you had the Gandhian plan, written by people, disciples of Gandhiji, who believed in village enterprise, Swaraj, what was called Gram Swaraj, cottage industry, anti-technology, anti-capital intensive industry. So you had these, various other models. And when the Planning Commission was formed in 1950, the members of the Planning Commission looked at all these plans, right? They read the People's Plan of M.N. Roy. They read the Gandhian plan. They read the Bombay Plan. And it is not a surprise that they finally chose to go with the Bombay Plan. Because that was a pragmatic plan. It was not ideological, but like the People's Plan and the Gandhian plan were both very heavily ideological, by which I mean they wanted to impose a particular regime of thinking on the people. Whether it was Gram Swaraj in Gandhiji's case or state-led industrialization in the People's Plan case. But I think Bombay Plan took the pragmatic approach that, look, there is a private sector, there will be a public sector, you need both, etc. Incidentally, there is in the last section of the Bombay Plan, they do say that at some point in the future, when private enterprise has enough money, then this public sector should be privatized. So the original idea of privatization is also there in the Bombay Plan.
Okay, which brings me to the next question, which was you have Indira Gandhi coming in and bank nationalization and all of those things. So post the Nehruvian era, what was the legacy of the Bombay Plan? Or was there a legacy of the Bombay Plan that continued post the 80s and the 90s?
No, in fact, the Bombay Plan was forgotten in the 50s. Forget about 70s, 80s and 90s. It was a forgotten document. As I said, in fact, the reason we reprinted the original document in this book is because there was no second edition. And fortunately, I had a photocopy of the original document. There was one copy in the Jawaharlal Nehru University Library.
Okay.
And, that was photocopied many years ago. And, when I was Secretary General of FICCI, I discovered that even FICCI, which funded this research at that time in 1944, didn't have a copy, didn't have an original copy of the Bombay Plan. So it was forgotten. I mean, I think once Mahalanobis came and Nehru came and, they rewrote history. They more or less buried the Bombay Plan.
But post-liberalization, you still see a lot of the same debates that happen all over and over again. Even when the current government came into power more than 5 years ago, you had similar conversations about the same indicators, about the same factors of the economy happening. So what do you think has changed with respect to conversations about these topics?
I think one negative feature of recent debates on economic policy in India is that far too many of those who write on India have been trained outside India. They are all become victims or slaves of very American way of thinking about the economy. And we are not that kind of an economy. We still have poverty. We still have the need for a large presence of the state in providing employment, in creating jobs, in modernizing agriculture, in creating infrastructure. Let's just look at the last couple of years. The current chief economic advisor, the previous chief economic advisor, the previous governors of the Reserve Bank, all educated in the US. They come with Western ideas to India without adequate understanding of the ground reality, the political reality of this country. So I think the reason why a book like this should be read today is to show how powerful indigenous thinking was. These are all guys who were sitting here and writing this document. Of course, they were influenced by thinking around the world, right? Many of them even studied abroad. But they were in India. They were working in India. They had an understanding of the Indian reality. They had a direct understanding, as employing people, etc. And that comes through this document. The fact that they had their feet on the ground and their head on their shoulders And they were not looking for recognition from professors in Yale and Princeton and Chicago Booth. And, today, too many of these Indian economists are looking for approval from Western peers. Nobody here was bothered about what the rest of the world thought. They were saying, this is what India should do to move forward.
That's very interesting because on one hand, I think you're coming from a place that says we need to also figure out what solutions work in India without adopting a lot of the models. Whereas you have a hyperbole from one set of people in this country who believe that only, more things should come from this country and that everything imported from the West is bad. But when we think about some indigenous knowledge, particularly about issues like this, one person who immediately comes to mind for me is Dadabhai Nauroji, for example, who wrote extensively about some of these issues. And I think even the roots of the Swatantra Party go back to him at one point. So we do sort of have figures, we do have a knowledge that existed with Indian economists, as you'd mentioned, who wrote extensively about these things. And I think searching for strains of them will provide us maybe with ideas about how we could figure out ways to reform our economy. Absolutely.
When I talk about Indian ways of thinking, I'm not asking people to go back to Mahabharata and Ramayana for understanding the economy. Right? I think that trend that we knew everything, they were our ancient rishis who could do bypass surgery and heart operation.
Nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata.
We had nuclear weapons, we had helicopters and all this utter nonsense. I believe in science. I believe in modern education and scientific explanation of things. What I'm saying is that whatever policies we evolve, they have to be based on a good understanding of the ground reality. The political economy of development. You cannot enunciate policy saying, this is good in theory. This is what some Nobel Prize winning economist said in a paper published in some very famous international journal, if it doesn't take into account the ground reality of this country. So when I talk about people with their feet on the ground, I'm not asking you to go back into history. Just look around what you have today and learn from the world. And in my view, that was the Chinese model. They were open to ideas from all over the world. But at the end of the day, they had their own model of development, which ensured agrarian reform, that ensured 100% literacy, that pursued excellence in educational institutions. So I think we can certainly develop a modern Indian model of development without going back in time. But based on modern concepts which are relevant for us.
We sort of spoke about this a little bit before, but why do you think, I didn't come across the Bombay Plan at all in my schooling. Why do you think it's instructive for someone of today to go back to the Bombay Plan?
For two reasons. One, simply to see how some of the enduring problems of this country are not problems of just today. They've been around for some time. And that, therefore, these are long-term challenges for us. And there is no magic wand, which is why I feel very uncomfortable with this thing, we'll become a $5 trillion economy in 3 years, 4 years time. No, there's a lot of hard work you have to do to get there. If you do the hard work, nobody can stop you from getting there. So I think, today's generation of students, particularly those who think about public policy, economy, etc., should realize that the challenges are fundamental. Whether it's dealing with agriculture, whether it's dealing with poverty, whether it's dealing with manufacturing, there are fundamental challenges. And second reason is to realize that, here were a group of people, 70, 80 years back, who were thinking about the same issues. And in that sense, in historic time, 80 years is not much. But on the other hand, in these same 80 years, look at where China is. Look at where Southeast Asia is, Malaysia, Indonesia. So we lost the bus in some senses. And my argument and the book's argument, all the co-authors' argument is, we lost the bus because we didn't pay attention to these basic ideas which were there.
All right, Dr. Baru, this is my last question to you. But if someone wants to read more about Indian ways of thinking about economics or about the Bombay Plan, what books or what resources would you recommend for them? Well,
there's a lot of literature now. I mean, you go back to the writings of people like K.N. Raj, who was head of the Delhi School of Economics, P.R. Brahmananda, who was the head of the Bombay Department of Economics, Prabhat Patnaik, who's a professor at Nehru University, Raja Chellaya. There are a lot of Indian economists who taught in Indian universities in the 60s, in the 70s, Amia Bakchi in Calcutta. Lots of them who have done basic research on this country and have shown ways forward for the country. We are very fortunate actually that we have this body of thinking of individuals who lived in India, understood the Indian reality, and wrote books. So there's enough literature. Thanks to Google, you can actually Google all these names. And I think most good departments of economics like at Delhi University or JNU would have syllabi including many of these writers.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Baru. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for this.
History is filled with what-ifs, but going down that road is romantic but counterfactual. Instead, we can try to emulate the spirit of the plan. If you want to read more about our economic historiography, I've attached a bunch of resources for you in the episode description, so do check those out. And if you want to delve deeper into some of the topics that we discuss on States of Anarchy, whether it's in public policy or foreign policy, I suggest you check out some of the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. They're of varying lengths depending on your interest, and you can always just attend the classes from home, so do check those out. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me at @HamsiniH on Twitter and @ States of Anarchy on Instagram. You can listen to States of Anarchy, not only on the IVM podcast app, but also on iTunes, Spotify, Savan, Audioboom, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts. So go subscribe and we'll be back next week.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Hi, I'm Satyajit.
Hi, I'm Racheta.
We are from the Open Library Project and we host a podcast called Paperback.
Paperback is a podcast where we engage with stalwarts and experts from various industries, suggesting non-fiction titles that contributed to their journey in a big way.
We've had guests like Anjali Raina, Dr. Marcus Rani, Dr. Swati Lodha, Ambi Parmeswaran, Apurva Damani, and many more on our show Paperback. Find new episodes every Wednesday on IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to podcasts.